They built the freaking market. They're the ones that designed the thing that we're all addicted to. So the idea that the
Right.
drug pusher gets to invoke, oh, well, this is what the addicted client actually wants is kind of astonishing. But on the other hand, it's totally true.
One little intellectual pet peeve of mine is originalism. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a law scholar, but this notion that you hear over and over again of that there should really only be an originalist interpretation of the law, that we should really only think about the law as the founders thought of it, and that any updates to that are off limits, makes me nuts. When I was at NBC, I was mulling the possibility of a series. I was pitching this for a while internally about the idea of future crimes, crimes that are clearly wrong, that we cannot and should not tolerate, but that are outside of the bounds of current law because we just haven't thought of the technological things that make it possible. Certainly the founders wouldn't have. Anyway, Lawrence Lessig, who was a very sort of big, iconic figure in my young life thinking about the internet, is someone whose own career makes it clear that we have to keep thinking about things. We have to keep changing our interpretation of the law because the technology keeps changing. And in the conversation you're about to hear between us, you'll hear just how this guy who grew up a conservative kid in Tennessee became this very free speech focused guy who's all about open source software and believed that kind of throwing open copyright so that, you know, all digital stuff was just sort of free and open to use and remix as you liked. He's now changed his thoughts again in the age of AI in a way that I think is incredibly instructive. So he's a Harvard professor. He's the founder of multiple amazing things, including Creative Commons, has been an open source guy, and then for the last 18 years has been focused mostly on fighting corruption in the United States and campaign reform. He's a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Lawrence Lessig. Lawrence Lessig, thank you so much for being on the Rip Current. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. So you were, you won't know this, but I was once upon a time an intern at Wired magazine long ago, back when there was mail to open at Wired magazine and people were sending press releases that way. And you were part of this sort of constellation of names that would kind of float through the offices in thinking about this, what I consider to be this kind of very innocent moment in the internet, where we were sort of, this is the late 90s, where we're migrating from this entirely academic invention to one that was a very fledgling commercial invention. And it felt to me like, I've spent the last couple of days kind of just reviewing all of the ways in which you interacted with that moment, and you were everywhere in that moment, as you continue to be everywhere in the current moment. But I wonder if you just want to talk to us a little bit about sort of where your head was at, because what I knew you as at that time was, the pioneer of Creative Commons and the idea, really an activist against the sort of the tyranny of copyright, and that you argued in many places that it was sort of holding culture back. Do you want to just kind of like, will you give us a little flavor of that so we get oriented in how you were thinking about it at that time?
Yeah, I guess, I had always been really geeky, interested in technology. I'm an old guy, so it's not like when I was in school, we had great technology, but, I was a programmer and I tried to learn how to code. And then I became a lawyer and a law professor. And when the internet came into view, it seemed like a perfect mix of these two passions that I had. And my initial instinct was that I thought the law was screwing things up. I
Hmm.
felt like a lawyer with a guilty conscience because I saw this platform that was creating an enormous opportunity for creativity and sharing knowledge and enabling a kind of collaboration we'd never seen enabled before. And the lawyers were coming in and trying to shut it down in the name of a version of cultural production that was inherited from the 1960s and 1970s. And it didn't seem to be justified at all. So very quickly, I shifted from being kind of just an academic, interested in this in an academic sense, to someone who felt like I needed to be an activist to drive policy in a way that would help the platform live up to some of its ideas. Now, at the same time, my academic writing, like my first book was Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. I was trying to emphasize the way in which the things we celebrate about the internet, like freedom of speech and privacy and the free right to innovate, were maybe unintended consequences of its design. Like the geeks who developed it originally developed it in a way that made it sense for what they were trying to do, and it just turned out that it was beautiful for free speech and beautiful for privacy and beautiful for innovation. But that architecture, that technical layer, was contingent. It could be changed. And what I was arguing for in that book was the idea that it would be changed, that you would have governments and commerce who would come in and try to transform it to make it serve them better, make it better, easier for them to sell products, or even easier for the government to surveil, to make sure they knew what people were doing. And so it was not just like fighting off like the lawyers representing the RIAA. It was also trying to get people to see how companies, as they embraced the internet and developed it and layered technologies on top of it, would begin to change its character. And we should just decide, is this the kind of internet we want, or is this the kind of internet we want to resist? And so that's what feels like the beginning was all.
So for you, that when you started to feel I'm curious, like where you started to notice a shift toward a kind of internet that you weren't as interested in. I know you got very interested in the notion of patenting software and thinking about open source software. Maybe that's later on, but like for you, when did sort of the prospect of this kind of, limiting, crushing influence of government and commerce make itself known? Like, what was a test case for you of that?
Well, I first began doing work in this area maybe 96. My first book came out in 99. And then I did a series of books about technology and the internet. So one was called The Future of Ideas, then Free Culture, and then a book called Remix. And that was until 2007. And by the time I finished that last book, it was just beginning to be clear that the platform was being transformed by the layer of the business model of advertising that was being layered on top of it. And, I think that at the beginning of the internet, nobody was thinking about the way AI-driven ads, obviously there was no AI for this technology, but nobody was thinking about that at all. Indeed, the Google, Larry and Sergey, when they launched Google saying there would be no ads. Like ads would be a corruption of a search engine.
Right. Zuckerberg had the same idea at one point.
Exactly. But then, they discovered that they needed a business model, and Google, when it began to discover the way in which it had enormous capacity to provide targeted information to advertisers, realized they had a money printing machine, and that began to be exactly everything they were focusing on. And then when Facebook began to present itself, it could argue it had a better money printing machine because it had more information about its users than Google did, because it actually had users who had profiles and shared with other people, as opposed to people just going to the web and like searching on Nike shoes or something like that. And that competition was just beginning to take off at the moment that I was kind of ejected from the field by friend and a genius and someone we eventually lost to suicide, Aaron Swartz, who convinced me, I still remember the day. It's at the end of 2006, and I'm in Berlin, and I'm preparing to give my first TED Talk, which was a TED Talk about copyright, and finishing Remix, and very proud of the work I was doing. And he came and he said to me, so tell me, why do you think anything you're arguing for is going to be possible so long as we have this deeply corrupted political system? And I said, Aaron, it's not my field. And he said, you mean as an academic? And I said, yeah, as an academic. I do copyright technology, but I don't do government corruption, the corruption of our political system. And he said, okay, but what about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And literally that night, by the end of the evening, I promised him I was going to give up my work on copyright and the internet.
He got you. He got under your
He got me.
skin.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And take up this fight. And that summer I announced I was leaving Creative Commons and I was starting this whole project on, the corruption, the we called institutional corruption. Congress was the kind of best example. And so that's now 18 years of that work
Hmm.
to try to tee up a solution to that problem. Meanwhile, the internet is radically transformed. I mean,
Yeah.
the business model of the internet is the fundamental problem, not just for the internet, but for democracy and for society generally. And understanding, and your book, I think, does this really powerfully, understanding what about it, what is the actual way in which it's not good for our brains? Like, why is
Yeah.
it not good for our brains? And how do we even understand this as speech anymore, as opposed to manipulation? Those, I think, are the really important, hard questions.
I was going back through a couple of your books and looking at sort of the way you were thinking about copyright. I mean, first of all, I just want to say how interesting it is, this notion that you thought that in 2006, Aaron Swartz basically convinced you that in some form your prior work needed to be put aside to make this later work about political corruption possible. And now we're in a world, and we're going to get to this more, I'm sure, in this conversation. Now we're in a world where those two interests are absolutely connected. I mean, couldn't be more closely connected. So it's crazy to me that like you thought you were abandoning that work, and it turns out it qualified you to be thinking about the weird moment we were in. So we'll get to that in a second here. But you wrote in Remix something that feels to me very emblematic of the spirit of that time, so here's what you wrote. With a practice of writing comes a certain important integrity. This is 2008. A culture filled with bloggers thinks differently about politics or public affairs, if only because more have been forced through the discipline of showing and writing why A leads to B. You also, in Free Culture, said something similar. You said the internet affects democracy as more and more citizens express what they think and defend it in writing. That will change the way people understand public issues. It is easy to be wrong and misguided in your head. It is harder when the product of your mind can be criticized by others. Now, I read that sentiment, and I think of a time, and I wonder if you sort of agree with this characterization, when there was a certain amount of creative discipline and effort required in engaging with the best parts of the internet. And that was this sort of blogging moment where having the chutzpah to just have the discipline to put it out there and to be in discussion on these, these sort of early communities that were formed. It really, there was a not a high barrier to entry, certainly not as high as it had ever been, but there was enough of a barrier to entry that people, I feel like their perspective was being kind of sharpened on the anvil of whatever that was. And I wonder where, like, I just want people to understand how things may have changed in your view. Like, how is it different now for you, looking back at that sentiment, now that we're in this world of a passive feed and AI remixing it for you without you having to do anything? Like, has your view on that changed at all?
Well, no, I think that's a really important thing to recognize. I'm embarrassed. I'm trying to remember between Snow Crash or Ender's Game, which has this theme in it, but there's a theme of like people writing these very long not long, but kind of Federalist paper like essays that's driving the debate in the community. And the aspiration, the thought is that the network is going to make it so people can be like talking in serious ways to each other, and that's going to raise the level of understanding substantially, and all of a sudden we're going to have a flourishing democratic kind of society. And that is a lot of what I think people imagined, certainly I was imagining in the early days of the internet. And in some sense, the business model of the internet was cool with that. It was totally okay. Like, when you have a business model like AOL, which you pay a flat monthly fee and you just get on and you're like in these discussion groups and you can write what you want and write in the group. The business doesn't care that you are like working hard to persuade others on a blog entry that 500 people are going to read. It doesn't care. It's not in the business of worrying about whether 500 people read it or 5 million people read it. it gets
Hmm.
the same regardless. And
Right.
so
Hmm.
it's an environment where what is separating people is like the extent to which people want to connect and want to follow, and it's an active project. And of course, remember the modalities were relatively narrow. We didn't have video. This is before
Right.
YouTube. You be beginning to get audio, but nobody had any comfortable way to be using audio. So this was the only medium, what you could write. And
Hmm.
so I had a blog, and early in the days, it was, the ranking of blogs is a very prominent blog, but, it was not a blog that getting 50 million views. It was a blog, it was just prominent in the early days of the internet. Then as the business model of the internet changes and the platforms realize like what they want is to pull people in and keep them engaged, because the longer they're engaged, the more they learn about their people. And the more they learn about their people, the more sophisticated the models will be that they can build about the users and then rent out to various advertisers or people who want them. Then the whole game changes. So,
Because we've left subscriptions behind, that kind of one size fits all
yeah,
commerce strategy. And now we're in a world where if you engagement is king.